Greenglass had a lot to say. He admitted that he had lied on the witness stand and that his false testimony had cost his sister her life. How do you think history will remember you?
As a spy that turned his family in.
Do you care?
Not particularly. I don't care.
Boy, you really don't like him, do you?
I love him like a brother. David Greenglass.
Hello, and welcome to A People's History of Violence, the podcast where we go entirely too deep into history's crimes, coups, conspiracies, cover-ups, assassinations, affairs, terrors, and trials. And my name is Isaac. I am a co-host.
And this is your co-host, Peter. And we are finally at the titular trial.
Trial day, folks!
Trial day, the big day. And the FBI, the G-men, have closed in on our group of communist spies and saboteurs. They didn't really do anything, but it goes together.
Yeah, they're kind of the opposite of saboteurs, but
Right.
Well, one of them at least was a spy.
Right. So, presumably by this time, the G-men have a rock-solid case, right, Isaac?
No!
Oh, really?
Yeah!
What kind of a case have they got then?
Probably the best term I could think of was bullshit on top of truth.
I see, okay.
So, where to begin here? We left off last episode, and I pity anyone who's just dropping in on this episode, part 4 of our series.
Go back and listen to at least part 3.
So, we left off this episode with the FBI having almost certain knowledge that this guy, David Greenglass, was almost certainly a person who took atomic secrets of some kind out of Los Alamos, gave them to another Soviet courier named Harry Gold, who gave them to a Soviet KGB contact. And they knew he was that because their information that they had written on their reports said that a source of unimpeachable reliability says that this guy's codename Caliber, who did all those things. Now, we now know that the source of unimpeachable, unquestionable reliability is actually the Venona Soviet cable translation and intercept program, where they were decoding or trying to decode everything that was sent to and from the New York KGB office inside the Soviet consulate. But the agents on the ground just know that there's something that's called T13, a source of unimpeachable reliability. So these FBI agents who are on David Greenglass's trail and on Julius Rosenberg's trail as kind of being his handler, they determine, and they write in their report, it has been determined that one Julius Rosenberg is probably identical with the individual described as Antenna, codename, and Liberal, also codename. It is also believed that David Greenglass is identical with the individual known as Caliber, cool name, and that Ruth Prince Greenglass, his wife, is identical with the individual codename Osa, and previously codenamed WASP. So once they have that information, they're set. They believe that they have the spies and just want them to be able to have these spies name the names of everyone else in their network. The trouble is that they operate in an actual legal system where you have to prove that things are true before a jury appears. They actually have to generate a case. And the way that they thread this needle, I think you're going to see with the trial, is by getting a whole stable of cooperative witnesses to say the things that they need them to say, even and especially when they're not exactly true. And the bizarre and ironic part about this is, as you listeners know from episode 2 and episode 3, is that David was and his wife Ruth were deeply involved as KGB assets and actually did do the transmission of atomic secrets, but they end up manufacturing evidence against Julius and, more importantly, Ethel Rosenberg, their in-laws, to spare their own necks and not actually telling the FBI everything.
So Just a brief aside, I don't think that we should necessarily... Obviously, it is better to live in a democracy than in a dictatorship. I do think that it wasn't just out of the goodness of their hearts and their dedication to democracy that the FBI and the rest of the legal system that wound up doing in the Rosenbergs did things according to even a crooked kind of procedure. I think it's because, as we talked about last episode, a certain amount of popular buy-in was necessary for the American prosecution of the Cold War, both at home and abroad. If we were going to incur the expense and the permanent warfare state that the Cold War entailed, there had to be popular buy-in. You didn't necessarily want a peak skill every weekend, but you did want these... You could call it... we'll see how we feel about this at the end when we're done talking about the trials. But looking at it, it does seem like there is a certain show trial quality.
Definitely. No, these trials were media events. You had prosecutors who had deep relationships with journalists and with the media at large to make sure that this type of trial, and this, as we described in the last episode, kind of stabbing back narrative as to why America wasn't doing so well in this part of the Cold War, didn't feel like it was doing well. This kind of trial was necessary. Where we left off, though, was David is in the Tombs, the jail in New York, and he's in FBI custody and being questioned repeatedly, sometimes actually daily. He gives statements on June 15th, 16th, and 17th of 1950 after he's arrested. And he went through a kind of metamorphosis. At first, he was equivocating and kind of thinking that he could give the FBI half the story and talk his way out of custody. But now, the switch is flipped, and he's starting to do exactly the opposite and embracing this kind of stool pigeon role. David begins naming not just Julius, who he at first gives kind of a small role, because after all, when David was doing all of his spy work during World War II, Julius had been fired as a KGB asset and was essentially on ice. But David begins naming all sorts of people he had contact with at Los Alamos, who the FBI then begins investigating. Most of these people never got arrested or indicted, although some of them lost jobs, lost family members, everything. This guy, Phil Salat, just keeps appearing in the FBI files repeatedly. And they do things like they find out whether they had subscriptions to the Daily Worker or other communist and communist adjacent newspapers or magazines. David's words expand the dragnet over every associate and friend and associates of associates and friends dramatically.
Right, and when you study this kind of legal campaign, if you want to call it that, there wasn't really an insurgency going on in the U.S., but there's a certain similarity to counterinsurgency campaigns or numerous other, and on TV shows they'll call it a fishing expedition. But what you want is as many names and addresses as possible. Right. So for a certain kind of investigator trying to sort of understand a larger subculture or organization that they're attempting to combat, this kind of witness is very valuable, especially if you can then, with very small amounts of information, you can then have leverage on these people. So I'm guessing that the fact that they had subscriptions to the Daily Worker was the kind of thing you could tell an employer about, and then that person gets fired. Is that right? Yeah,
and basically at each stage, the leverage that you have produced by the potential criminal liability, potentially going to jail, potentially being indicted, becomes the force that you can use to squeeze someone to produce more links in the chain, this ever-expanding circle.
Yes.
And in David's case, David's basically become a weapon. And he turns out to be a very ideal manipulable weapon because David just loves bullshitting. And not necessarily about his spy stuff. One of the things that Walter and Marion Schneer pointed out early on is that David told the FBI agents and the federal prosecutors, as they call themselves, AUSAs, AUSAs, on the case that he was selected for a very specialized, special group within the Special Engineering Detachment who would be tasked with taking the newly made atomic bomb and going out to the Pacific to detonate and be a part of this new detonation explosion. And so they asked people at Los Alamos this because they're like, well, was David involved in all this? I mean, while he was a spy? And they go, no. What? We never even talked to David about doing that. What are you talking about?
Did it actually happen, this test? I thought that atomic tests were mostly in the desert.
Well,
I mean,
later on they had Pacific.
Yeah, the Bikini Atoll. And stuff.
No, he was essentially saying that he was selected for this like kind of like prototypical Bikini Atoll type test, and
well
he
before,
never was. Nah.
Well before they were even doing them.
Correct.
It sounds like. Okay. He just saw Bikini Atoll in the news and thought, hey, this is kind of related.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Now, of course, even though he's naming off all these people at Los Alamos, anyone who he remotely was friends with, they need people to indict. And of course, they're really after the person they believe to be codename Liberal and codename Antenna, Julius Rosenberg, David's brother-in-law. Because they believe that he is a recruiter, a paymaster, spy terms a handler of people like David who are more like his assets. And to produce more of a case to actually get indictments out of David, they start engaging in a process which includes some factual information, right? David does say some facts, like Julius is the one who asked him to go ahead and see if you can bring stuff for the KGB. Julius is almost certainly the one who put him in touch with an actual Soviet agent. Beyond that, we know from the actual records that pretty much stopped there.
So that's
during the war. Yeah,
that's a truth that you mentioned on which the bullshit is built.
Yeah, the bullshit that is built on top of it is a whole host of allegations about what kind of a spy lifestyle Julius engaged in, and more importantly, they also begin inventing aspects later of meetings that Julius had, so that rather than David and Ruth interacting with a Soviet agent and putting themselves into the fire, instead it's David and Ruth interacting with Julius, who then puts off information to a Soviet agent. And then after that, Ruth and David interacting with Julius and Ethel and putting both of them in the hot seat.
So this might be premature, but how is it from the Venona cables that we know that these meetings that would have happened with David Greenglass and a KGB agent, is that where we know them from?
This gets a little bit technical, but the way we know that is actually through the Vasiliev.
The Vasiliev, okay, but some sort of Russian source.
Yeah,
right.
It's actually reports transcribed from a KGB file.
So there's Russian sources that say KGB met with the Greenglasses, and David, when talking to the FBI, would say, "Oh no, I was actually meeting with Julius."
Yes, but eventually that's what the story becomes.
Yes,
at this time, in the early stages when he's just talking and kind of spinning his wheels.
This time being the time of the initial arrest.
The initial arrest, his first interrogation, months for
Greenglass's arrest.
Of FBI interrogations and stuff like that. David's not saying anything about really meetings where he passes off information directly to a Soviet agent. He just doesn't say that at all. He admits that he met with Harry Gold, and he admits that he talked to Julius about spy. And that's kind of it. But he does go through a metamorphosis, and probably one of the best examples I have of how this process of producing new information happened is this report where they begin asking David about a wristwatch that they find in Ethel and Julius's apartment. They've arrested Julius, search his apartment after they arrest him again. And in searching the apartment, they found a wristwatch. And they asked David Greenglass was shown a lady's wristwatch with a gold wristband, alleged to be the property of Ethel Rosenberg. David Greenglass stated that he did not recognize the watch at all, and had no recollection of ever seeing it in the possession of Ethel Rosenberg. David Greenglass advised at first that he had no recollection of Julius Rosenberg telling him that Ethel had received the wristwatch as a gift from the Russians or anyone else. However, on second thought, David Greenglass recalled that while he was working at the Pitt Machine Products Company, Julius Rosenberg mentioned to him that Ethel had gotten the watch as a gift. But Julius did not say specifically the source of his gift, except to indicate vaguely that it came from some friends. David was of the opinion that this meant it came from the Russians.
Do we know the turnaround time between those two statements? When he's saying you know nothing about them, and then when he said I do know something about it?
Yeah, unfortunately we don't. I mean, the report says that there were 3 interview times. So it says that this happened on August 22nd, 31st, and September 1st of 1950.
Okay, so within 2 weeks.
Within 2 weeks, but they have 3 interviews with him. And it seems logical that the first interview, he's like, no, I've never seen this fucking watch before.
Yeah.
Second or third interview, he's like, oh yeah, now that you mention it, I think this is a KGB watch.
Yeah. So it seems like he's playing off what he thinks his interrogators want to hear.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which is a classic problem with interrogation of any kind, whether torture, non-torture. I mean, it's a classic question in any kind of investigation is people will try to please you.
Especially, David is under indictment for conspiracy to commit espionage. He is potentially facing the death penalty.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And more importantly for David, though, at least in his later talking about it, is Ruth, his wife, is not in prison yet, hasn't been indicted, hasn't been arrested, is pretty still grievously injured. She just came out of hospital. And keeping her out of indictment, keeping her out of jail, is kind of his ambition in saying these stories.
And himself, I imagine.
Yeah.
So we have a vague idea of what Greenglass was trying to say about Julius, but we know we know that Ethel gets swept up in it too.
Yeah, and that's a whole process. So Julius is arrested,
or rather rearrested, on July 17th, not just detained for an interview like he was before.
Yeah.
And he stays in jail now for the remainder of his living life. Ethel doesn't get arrested until a month later. And when you look through the FBI files, which only got released, remember, in the mid to late 1970s, through the efforts of a lot of lawsuits, you find statements like this. David is interviewed by prosecutor Miles Lane. Was Ethel present on any of these occasions where he says that they're talking about spying, talking about doing espionage, sharing information? Never. Did Ethel talk to you about it? Never. She never spoke to me about it, and that's a fact. Aside from trying to protect my sister, believe me, that's a fact.
So how then, if Greenglass is the main source of information, and he's saying all this, how does Ethel get involved?
David is not the first to volunteer any information on Ethel. The first person to volunteer any information on Ethel, unfortunately, is David's wife, Ruth, who's already been told by her lawyer, O. John Rogg, to go ahead and cooperate fully. And what she claims at this time is that it wasn't just that Julius told her, you need to tell David or about, we can share information with the Russians. When you go to Los Alamos, convince David to pass along information. She says that both Julius and Ethel convinced her to do that. And still, even at this time, David has not gone along with that story, but that's the bare minimum that Ethel is involved in. It's literally a conversation in November, December of 1944, in which she supposedly said, well, you should at least ask David if he wants to do it. We already know from the facility of notebooks that this conversation likely didn't happen. We have a full report of the conversation they had. We know Ethel was there, but in the translation from Vasiliev's notebook, she says something like, if David does this, he should be careful, or David should be careful.
Right.
And the other kind of logical reason we know this didn't happen is Ruth didn't actually need any convincing to do this.
Right.
Ruth was already recruited, was already given a code name, WASP, and had already sent in a letter to David, oh, I know where you are. David had sent her a letter back saying, like, you should tell Julius where I am, and words to those effect. She was already all in wanting to share information. She didn't need to be extra convinced by Ethel Rosenberg. That didn't happen.
Right. So do we know why then Ruth was saying all this?
I mean, there's kind of different theories. Emily and David Ullman, in their book Exoneration, kind of elaborate a lot of detail on the resentment that Ruth likely felt. Even though both the Rosenbergs and the Greenglasses are broke working class families on the Lower East Side, that Ruth was a lot worse off in her tenement building, soon to be demolished in New York urban renewal, than Julius and Ethel were in their, again, like maybe 2-bedroom, I think, apartment in Knickerbocker Village, which I think if there's New Yorkers listening to us, is not a luxurious condominium development. And wasn't back then, but it was solid modern housing back then compared to a lot of the flats like people like the Greenglasses were in, where they had to heat the apartment by opening up the oven and turning it on full blast. So maybe that's it.
Some resentment on those grounds.
Yeah, they kind of speculate about that. I'm of the impression that Ruth was a more savvy customer than David, whereas David's the type of guy that will just keep talking until he thinks he's giving you the story that you want to hear.
Right.
Ruth much more logically considers how the gears of a lie or a denial she set up fit into an overall narrative that makes sure that she's not guilty, but someone else is. So while David, when he's interrogated accidentally or intentionally or whatever, implicates his own wife, Ruth, pretty quickly, Ruth, when she's first, braced by like 2 or 3 FBI agents all in a hospital bed, says, I don't believe David said any of that, and he wouldn't have said that because it's not true. Just total flat denial.
Yeah.
Like, much tougher customer.
Yeah.
So I'm of the mind that Ruth made this story at first to remove from the narrative the notion that she was a willing and voluntary spy from the ground up. Rather, she needed to be convinced, and not just convinced by Julius, who's she's not that close to, but also Ethel.
Right.
Both of them working together to convince her, at least tell David, and then that caused her to tell David, who reluctantly, but nevertheless still, in his stupid ways, did so.
So sort of creating additional links in the chain of responsibility to maintain a distance between, a greater distance than actually existed between themselves, the Greenglasses, and whatever was going on in the Rosenberg operation, and sort of throwing enough sort of chaff and lack of clarity in the air.
Exactly. Making herself, from the beginning, when she talks, she makes herself as a character into a reluctant and extremely minor participant. When in reality, as we know from episode 2, Ruth was a willing courier and volunteered and directly met, as far as we can tell, with Soviet agents. And she never talked about that her entire life. Now, there's a bit of a side story that becomes a little bit important with the trial that we should also bring into the narrative here, which is, as we know, Julius recruited loads of his friends from CCNY, from the good old late 30s and early 40s, to pass along information through him to Soviet agents. One of those was a guy named Morton Sobel. And we know that Morton Sobel did this because he admitted to New York Times journalist Sam Roberts in 2008 that he did actually pass along stuff in World War II. And told Sam Roberts at the time this was stuff of a defensive nature, concerned with probably the stuff he was working on, radio communication, radar, and so on. But
in June of 1950, before Julius's arrest,
Morton Sobel makes a nice planned vacation to Mexico, let's say, and goes across the border. But crucially, he goes to Mexico using his own name. His wife, Helen Sobel, uses her own name. He's got his kids with him. He rents an apartment in his own name. But then, probably as news stories started coming in that, the heat is definitely on, when Julius Rosenberg is arrested, he begins making inquiries around Mexico about how to, say, go to Europe from Mexico and, not use a passport, and begins using great names like Morton Solt.
Yeah, that'll throw him off the trail.
That'll throw him off the trail. But David Greenglass doesn't actually know anything about Morton Sobel. Morton Sobel's lawbreaker, witness type person is a guy named Max Ellicher. Max Ellicher, for all intents and purposes, for a long time was practically speaking Morty Sobel's best friend, or at least in his top 5. Mm-hmm. He was the best man at Morton Sobel's wedding. And Max Ellicher's family and Morton Sobel's family, and Max's wife is also named Helen, had actually adjoining yards on their houses.
That's
their
nice.
kids played together. Max Ellicher, however, has been under investigation by the FBI by this point for over 2 years. Mm-hmm. Because he was a part of a Communist Party cell in the Naval Department, and after President Truman and Congress introduced loyalty oaths, where you say, I have not been a member of the Communist Party or any groups that the Attorney General says are communist affiliated or subversive or whatever, he signed that, which means he's now committed perjury. So the FBI has a lot over on Max Ellicher, but what Max Ellicher just chooses to do in August of that year is super cooperate, just like David Greenglass. And he doesn't actually give a lot of evidence against Morton Sobel at this time, other than to, and we'll talk about this a little bit with the trial, other than to implicate Morton Sobel and Julius, his good friend, in being really shady and suspicious and maybe possibly doing spy stuff.
After Max Ellicher gave up his information, Morton Sobel was then, kidnapped by hired goons from the Mexican Secret Police, or DFS, and brought to the United States. The prosecution would later make the wild claim that he was legally deported. Hopefully more about this in a later episode.
Interesting. So how long is it between the arrests and the trial?
So the arrest and the trial, actually, it's a good distance of time, but for a big federal death penalty espionage trial, it's actually not that much time. But trials actually moved pretty fast back then, frankly, because the discovery process was pretty constrained. The defense didn't know a lot of what the prosecution was about to put on. So
were the rules of disclosure the same back then as they are now?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
And that's really what's going to make this trial pretty hard to have won.
Yeah.
In my opinion. But we do know is that on August of 1950, the prosecution hadn't even decided whether to arrest Ethel Rosenberg. Because they say the evidence against her is not strong. All they have is that conversation. However, they put her before the grand jury, and when asked a whole bunch of questions by the grand jury, who, just a little aside about grand juries, they tend to be older, whiter, retired, wealthier.
Right.
One grand jury that wasn't this one, but was one for a whole bunch of people who kind of are part of the general, the same kind of espionage by being vaguely members of communist organizations framework. The grand jury that Harry Gold testified to that put Miriam Motzkowitz, who knew Ethel Rosenberg, in jail later, in prison and stuff like that. That grand jury was led by the landlord of Knickerbocker Village.
Oh, wow. The Lord of the Manor.
The Lord of the Manor. You have a kind of a medieval lordship quality. I think his name was... I can't find it. But yeah, the head of the corporation that owned Knickerbocker Village was the head of the grand jury. And he loved, while he was on the grand jury, he would give reports to the FBI about how he believed that Knickerbocker Village was infested by communists.
Ugh.
So I guess the Lord of the Manor was cleaning up town there.
I guess so.
To my knowledge, that wasn't this grand jury. This grand jury had Ethel Rosenberg in front of it. And it was a very agitated grand jury. As you can imagine, with the atmosphere of the time, which we described with the Peekskill riots and this whole atmosphere of extreme fear of communism, they were browbeating her with questions. And what she was doing was just invoking her Fifth Amendment right, which is to say she was going to not answer the questions.
Yeah.
They didn't go, oh, you're invoking your Fifth Amendment right? I guess I
so
guess
obviously, you're invoking your Fifth Amendment right, so obviously you're guilty.
Yeah. It was, how can you do this? Because a little thing called the Korean War started right as these arrests were going on. So in a state of heightened panic where now the U.S. is actually sending troops to fight a communist country.
Right. And it's not looking good.
And it's not looking good. They're getting pushed all the way back to the boots on perimeter.
Right, and it looks like it could potentially begin World War III.
Yeah, they're now pointing the finger at a petite Jewish woman from the Lower East Side going, why won't you tell us what you know?
And people aren't inclined to challenge that.
No.
At least not, the burghers of Manhattan, New York County.
Yes, exactly. So she gets discharged from this grand jury proceeding. They send her home. But on the way home, before she gets on the subway, she is arrested by the FBI and held in jail again for the rest of her living life.
Yes.
But it's only in March of 1951. So a good 9 months before, a good 9 months after that, before this trial begins on March 6, 1951. And I guess it's as good a time as any to kind of give a general flyover evaluation of this trial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's the American system at its best, right?
Even for the time, this was a weird trial.
A weird one.
You had a judge, Judge Irving Kaufman, who lobbied to get appointed to this case, and explicitly let it be known that if put on this case, he would give the death penalty.
Wow. Was that his sole decision to make?
As to whether to give the death penalty?
Yeah.
So if the jury was to... for an Espionage Act guilty verdict, if a jury was to give a guilty verdict, say they did it, then yes, sentencing is his sole prerogative as a judge. However, he's not supposed to predetermine an outcome of his sentencing.
Of course.
Because the whole point is that as a judge, you're supposed to be impartial until evidence has been submitted.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And this includes not just factual evidence, like did they do it or not, but sentencing evidence, what they call mitigation evidence, which is how guilty were they, and are there other factors you should consider?
Right, like the fact they have two small children. And Ethel has committed no crimes in the rest of her life, for example. Right. Or, so I wasn't trying to dispute that. What I was asking about was who has sort of the authority over what in that room. So he's a federal judge?
Yes.
Okay.
He was a federal judge. Eventually, he went to the appeals court. He tried to use this case, and he knew it at the time. He was going to try to use this case to go all the way to the Supreme Court and get what was talked about among the, frankly, anti-Semitic kind of WASP establishment at the time as the Jewish seat on the Supreme Court.
Awesome.
Which had been held at the time by Felix Frankfurter. He's on FDR staff.
Yeah.
But
had the secretary hold the calls?
Yeah, but he's not the only actor here. Obviously, this being an American jury trial, they get to pick a jury. Ethel and Julius, after managed to land on the father and son team of Emanuel Bloch and his father Alexander Bloch. Manny Bloch at the time was in his 50s. His father, Alexander, was in his 70s. A little more detail may be needed here on Manny and Alex Bloch. The attorney Julius first reached out to, he was first detained and interviewed by the FBI in June of 1950, was the firm that helped him with his loyalty investigations during World War II, see APHov 1. There he spoke to Leonard Boudin, an experienced defender of radicals in these politicized anti-communist type cases. Boudin, however, was occupied already with too many of these cases at the time and recommended Manny Bloch, who had handled some of these anti-communist cases himself, but whose experience was mainly as a civil lawyer specializing in assisting bakeries and advising the furriers union. Bloch's political sympathy ensured that he would be a zealous advocate, not sell the Rosenbergs out the way O. John Rogue had with the Greenglasses, and he fought in this trial, but he was simply not an experienced criminal trial lawyer. Spy cases, I think Manny Bloch mentioned that after he took the case, if an attorney saw him who he knew, they would try to go on the other side of the street and not look at him.
So why is that? I mean, isn't everybody entitled to defend? I mean, gangsters and murderers, they all had defense.
Yeah, that's the funny part, is at this time, you're probably better off as a lawyer if you took the case of a gangster like Lucky Luciano or
why is that, though?
Landscape. Being on one of these politicized communist cases, one of these political cases like this or the Smith Act prosecutions, was an express train to potentially getting disbarred or to having no more cases in general.
Wow.
Keep in mind that
So
with the Smith Act lawyers, which was even worse, is when they started making certain defenses and certain arguments, or being implicated by the prosecution in doing that, the judge started holding them in contempt. And when you are held in contempt, if you don't get yourself out of contempt by doing what the judge says the court wants you to do, you can be thrown in jail. And they were.
Wow. So the bar agent, the bar associations and the judges kind of cooperated, I assume, with the state to make defenses more difficult for...
Yeah. And I don't think that they had to like draw up a conspiracy to do this. I think they just went along with the
just kind of
time.
organic.
Yeah. With what was in the water. So Manny Block and his father, along with Morton Sobel's attorney, Kuntz, they have the task of trying to pick a jury with the prosecution. This should be kind of a 1-1 process where you're trying to get people who are impartial. But also, as we all know, people's history and perspectives factor into how they're going to see a case. Now, this is a federal jury, so it's not necessarily just drawing along from
the neighborhood.
Exactly. You have a lot more people from leafier precincts, let's say.
Yeah, it's not so many from Knickerbocker Village. They didn't get the landlord, for instance, on the jury.
No, they didn't get the landlord, for instance. And one thing that is striking about this is even though New York City at the time has a Jewish population that's almost 30 to 40% of the population, there are no Jewish people on this jury.
Interesting.
With 2 Jewish defendants. And for almost certainly for appearance's sake, they have Kaufman, who's a Jewish judge, and the prosecution team, with I think one exception, is almost exclusively Jewish. That's Irving Sapol, Roy Cohn, James Kilsheimer, Miles Lane. If you're like, Roy Cohn, wasn't he Donald Trump's lawyer?
Yeah.
Yes. This is baby Roy Cohn, though, but he's
Yeah.
still just as much of a little shit.
Still terrible. This is how he gets hooked into Angels in America eventually, between that and his dying of AIDS.
Yeah.
Yeah, because so they're drawn from all across the state of New York, I guess?
Not across the state of New York. It's from the federal district that it's in. So you have Eastern District of New York and Southern District of New York, but this takes place within that district. It actually has a big jurisdiction around it that counts as part of that federal thing. So it draws from that pool. And if I could say one kind of ideal character type that these people fall under, it's the bank examiner from It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
You have a bunch of people who are involved in like the financial department or auditing at their firms and are
sticklers.
Yeah, I feel like this kind of
sticklers.
This kind of like wound up, you know,
waspy,
like Babbitt guy isn't as much of like a type anymore.
Yeah.
But this was like 8 out of the 12 people in this jury.
Right. Yeah. What would the type even be these days? Like. They've all turned into like Dwight Schrute from The Office.
Yeah, Dwight Schrute's like the unhinged falling down version.
Right.
Of this type of guy.
Yeah.
But that's your jury.
Okay, that's fine.
So no Jews. There is one African American person. There is one woman.
Okay.
In case our listeners think Peter and I are exaggerating or playing loose with the details of the jury, here's a few of their backgrounds. We have Chauncey Miller, who's secretary of the Board of Commissioners of Pilots, Communist American Legion. Charles Christie, an auditor for an oil company who was casually acquainted for 2 years with an FBI agent through his church organization. Howard Beck, another auditor for the Irving Trust Company, a Lutheran and on his local church board. Charles Duda, an auditor for a soft drink concentrate company. Harold Axley, a partner in owning a bar in the Bronx, and had a wife named Ruth. To cap it all off, we have James Gibbons, an accountant for New York Omnibus Company, and jury foreman Vincent Liebenite, a sales manager from White Plains who was both a military policeman and attended Fordham, just like the judge on this case. So if you were looking for a jury that would be skeptical that the U.S. attorney would put on a true case, as you kind of need here, this was not your jury.
So let's talk about these prosecutors. Or do we want to do that?
So I'll recap. I'll say this about the prosecution team is by any minimum standard today, they're profoundly unethical. from the beginning, when they don't have a bit of testimony that they want, they just literally go back to the witness and they're like, "Are you sure you didn't hear blah, blah, blah?" Until they get the testimony that they want. They have FBI reports that show that people are lying. In their stable of witnesses, they don't care. They come up with last-minute witnesses who very clearly seem to be lying, and they don't care. And they push and fight this case, obviously, all the way until getting a death sentence. But more than anything else, as to how they're profoundly unethical, is they knew from the beginning that they didn't have evidence against Ethel. And they knew they didn't have evidence against Ethel because she probably wasn't involved. To the point where Irving Sapol, the head prosecutor on there, wrote a memo about it. Don't have that much evidence against Ethel. Haven't decided whether to arrest her. They haven't arrested Ruth. Why should they arrest Ethel?
Right.
But they go for it anyways to, in quote, have leverage over Julius. So their entire prosecution, their entire case is not, as they say in law school, a search for the truth. It's not to vindicate the rights in the United States, make sure someone was bad. It's literally just to take a hostage.
Right.
Ethel, in any way they can, make sure that Julius gets convicted. We don't reflect, I think, a lot on how... We reflect a lot on like how a policeman has a lot of power. That's completely unaccountable. Prosecutors have a lot of power. They don't feel like they have a lot of power, I can say from experience, because they're hemmed in by a bureaucratic system.
Right.
And they have
so
to
are cops.
Yeah.
Cops
they have to
routinely complain about
They have to do reports and everything like that. But to the ordinary person, like, say, an Ethel Rosenberg, housewife on the Lower East Side, Irving Sapol has the power of life and death. Because he can make a case out of thin air.
Right. So what's the actual evidence that we're working with here?
Maybe we should take a break before this.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And I think this case basically is a fraud and a frame-up.
If it had been a frame-up, which it was not, it would have had to have been a very gigantic conspiracy.
Very often when a frame-up is done, it isn't done on a mass scale and involves a whole host of people on just the entire matter. Little bits of evidence, quote, get developed. And possibly the last person to receive the evidence might believe it's true, although the donor of that evidence might know it's false.
You did not have a memory at the time of Ethel typing up those notes.
I had no memory of that ever. None whatsoever.
And did Cohen encourage you to testify that you saw Ethel typing up the notes?
Of course he did.
So we're at the trial. We're at the actual trial. In which case I should probably talk about what evidence the prosecution introduced. Now, one of the things that you will hear on this case in any narrative describing it is that the smoking gun of this case is David Greenglass's testimony. And that is the crux of this case. All the appeals courts who have to look at the record and look at the transcript afterwards say, like, okay, well, no David Greenglass, no case. No crime. But the first witness the prosecution puts on is not David Greenglass or Ruth Greenglass or any of the people we talked about. It's Max Ellicher, Morton Sobel's best friend. And I actually think this testimony has likely had a pretty strong effect on the jury that's not actually been a part of the discourse on this case. And I say that because it provides a separate and independent point of confirmation for saying Julius Rosenberg is a spy who runs other spies. So even if your whole case, as Julius and Ethel's lawyers want to say, is that Ruth and David are lying, they are confessed spies, you shouldn't believe them, they're perjurers, they're just trying to not go to the death chamber. Even if you believe that, there's a separate guy who's not Ruth or David who's saying, I think Julius is a spy. So what does Max Ellicher actually say? So as we said, Max Allicher is facing himself a perjury charge for saying he's not a communist when, as FBI investigation determined, he was at one time. And in order to keep working in defense, he said that in 1944, so during the war, when Julius was at the prime of his running information over to the Russian stuff, he approached him in Washington, where he was working for the Naval Department, and said, I think you should maybe pass some information along. We need to help our allies, the Russians. Julius's usual spiel. Mm-hmm. The Russians are bearing the brunt of the Nazi menace. We need to help our allies, etc. Allicher's not involved in any atomic stuff. This is pure. This is
the proximity fuses.
Proximity fuse type stuff.
Yeah.
At the Naval Department, he's not dealing with that, but he's dealing with this military hardware and help our allies, the Russians.
Okay.
He says that Julius gave him this approach, and when he balked at this, he said, well, come on, Morty's doing it too. Huh. It's Julie and Morty.
Yeah.
And that Max Allicher, talked to Morton Sobel about this, and Morton Sobel said, grumbling Julius shouldn't have told you that. I feel pretty confident that this part happened. Right? It overlaps with everything we know that Julius was doing at the time. Mm-hmm. He's motivated. He's reaching out to CCNY people. Mm-hmm. Max Allicher's Morty's friend.
Right. This part's believable. What we now know to be false is what Max Allicher testifies to next. And this is kind of a People's History of Violence exclusive, because no one really went back on this part of the trial transcript, because, I'll be honest, after Morton Sobel said he did it, right,
no one really cared about Morton Sobel.
Yeah.
Max Allicher claims that Julius and Morton Sobel tried to, in the years after 1945, after the war is over, and before 1948, tried to get him to pass along more information to help out their Soviet contact. The problem with that is there is no spy network to pass that shit along to during this time.
Right, like we said, they shut down the spy network after the Gusenko affair, right?
Exactly. They put everything on ice. And I've talked to some people who are pretty knowledgeable about the case and about Morton Sobel and stuff about this. And their kind of defense to Max Allicher's testimony is, there is a Vasiliev notebook entry that says that Julius kept in touch and his network remained intact. To which I'd say, he kept talking to his CCNY friends. But if you're taking photos or taking documents and there's no Soviet contact to pass them along to,
it's not espionage.
There's nothing to do.
It's photography.
They shouldn't be doing that, right? But there's no evidence that they did, because there's no entries, there's no contact, there's no Julius Rosenberg in the form of a liberal or whatever is trying to contact us and give us these photos. There's nothing for those 2 years. So Max Allicher testifies that Morton Sobel is we got to pass along the fire control mechanism that you're working on these ships. That couldn't have happened.
It would have been plugging it into a dead socket.
Exactly. He gives another incident, though, which happens in July of 1948 when the network is just reactivated. Mm-hmm. And we know that Julius Rosenberg is back in contact with the Soviets. And we know that he's probably reached out to Morton Sobel, codenamed Senya. But this incident itself is pretty weird. Max Allicher says that he was thinking about moving to the place near Morton Sobel. He's living in Washington, D.C. at the time. Morty Sobel has had a good job and living in Flushing, New York. He just got a house. Side story, he had a contractor work on, and he didn't like the work the contractor said, so he told all the people at his work he's going to put out a big sign in his neighborhood that says, "Don't work with this contractor and steal your money."
Awesome.
That's the kind of guy Morty is. But Max Allicher is driving up to go see the neighborhood to see if he wants to move up there to Flushing, New York, and see if he can find a place. When he drives up to see Morty, he senses he's being followed by the FBI. Spoiler, he is. They have full surveillance of Max Allicher, according to their reports, and all of the physical surveillance logs appear to be gone. Fun fact. So he says, "Oh my god, I'm being followed, probably by the G-Men." He goes to Morty's house. He says, "Morty, I think I'm being followed by the FBI." And Morty goes, "Oh, well, I have something in my house which is too dangerous to be kept at my house. So let's go drive to Catherine Slip, which is, I walked it. It's like 2 blocks away from Knickerbocker Village. It's 2 blocks away from like 10 Morton Street in New York. Let's go drive there right now as you're being followed. And he takes a 35 millimeter film can and puts it in the glove and gets in the car with Max Ellicher, and they drive to that place where Morty steps out of the car, takes the can of film out, goes off, possibly meets with Julius Rosenberg, and comes back and says, "Okay, it's fine." Can we just break this down a little bit?
While the G-men were following.
Yeah, so he says, "I'm being followed by the FBI," and Morty Sobel says, "Oh, I better take the evidence of the crime, get in your car, drive from Flushing all the way down to Lower Manhattan to Catherine Slip, meet up with my contact, give him the evidence of the crime, all while the FBI is physically looking at you, and now me, and now him."
Yeah. All right. That's one way to do it. It's...
Okay, so people have tried to kind of fit the square peg of this testimony into the round hole of this caper that supposedly happened in July of 1948 or 49 or somewhere else, where Julius and another CCNY classmate, and Morton Sobel are taking photos of jet propulsion stuff. But if that happened the way they say it did, how come Morton Sobel has a film can with him and took it home to Flushing and then kept it at home in Flushing, and then in late July is like, "Oh shit, you're being followed. This is a great time not to flush this down the toilet or put it in the garbage or burn it like you would."
Or just not do anything with it.
Or just leave it in your house.
Yeah, until they drive elsewhere.
Yeah. So I think this is bullshit.
Yeah.
But again,
So you think Ellicher made this story up?
I think with the encouragement of the FBI.
And the logs are gone.
He's under physical surveillance. Why isn't there a physical surveillance log saying Max Ellicher drove from Flushing down Lower Manhattan to Catherine Slip in the middle of the night with Morton Sobel? Right. You should be able to put 2 agents on to say we saw him do that.
Yeah.
But they don't.
But this still comes up in the trial testimony.
Exactly. Not only does this come up, but also, it's an additional claim. He says that Morton Sobel comes back in the car and says, "Oh, Julius said he's also worried about Elizabeth Bentley, but thinks that she didn't see him." I messed this one up a little bit. So let me just read from the trial transcript. Max Ellicher says, "He then said Rosenberg had told him that he once talked to Elizabeth Bentley on the phone, but he was pretty sure she didn't know who he was, and therefore everything was all right. We proceeded back to the house." Elizabeth Bentley was another one of these Guzhenko-type witnesses who was involved in kind of communist espionage-type work.
It's like if you were making up something about the January 6th defendants, and I'm not comparing the January 6th people to the Rosenbergs and the Greenglasses in terms of their politics. It's just kind of a funny way of thinking about it. You're like, oh yeah, we followed Stuart Rhodes from the Oath Keepers as he drove to dispose of text messages planning the attack on the Capitol, to hand them over to Gavin McInnes from the Proud Boys, and then he came back and he was like, Gavin McInnes is worried about Ann Coulter.
Yeah, Ann Coulter might tell on her.
Right, might tell on us all. Because Bentley is a different animal than Sobel and Julius.
She's not a real fact witness, except in a very tangential.
And no one would tell Ann Coulter anything that they wanted
So to Sobel's attorney's credit, because Sobel's attorney knows that Max Ellicher is basically the one real witness, what they call fact witness against Sobel, so he says actual stuff that Sobel did that seems like a crime. Remember, they're only trying to prove conspiracy to commit espionage. So even if no espionage actually happened, if he's trying to do it, he has an agreement to it, then he's part of it. So he does barely manage to cross that little threshold. But Sobel's attorney, to his credit, cross-examines Max Ellicher and gets out the times, the time in which interview he actually said each of these claims. To the point where you can see that Ellicher's story is developed by FBI agents saying basically like, well, are you sure? Do you know if he said anything about Elizabeth Bentley? And Ellicher facing a perjury charge saying, oh yeah.
Yeah, right? Yeah. I was just thinking that wouldn't any defense lawyer make mincemeat out of all this?
Yeah, but keep in mind that with both Cohen, who's Sobel's attorney, and especially with Manny Block and Alex Block,
right,
they have a very aggressive judge, and they don't want to just be put in jail for contempt. And so there are objections made, but this judge questions the judge in this case questions the witnesses like a prosecutor would, and he is using the kind of full force, the kind of Wizard of Oz like intimidation that a federal judge can have, especially if you have a lot of authority, a lot of gravitas, to make people talk, and he does. He makes people respond in the witness stand. He makes people look stupid. He makes them look silly. And something to also keep in mind is that for a jury, the judge is their friend and their protector.
Right.
He's the one that makes the bad court stuff stop. He's the one that makes the things run on time. He makes the lawyers stop fighting.
Right.
They usually have a lot of respect for him.
He lets them go and have snacks.
Yeah.
Take breaks.
So in addition to that, Sobel's attorney, in addition to getting out that the Elizabeth Bentley claim came out in his third FBI interview, not his first, not his second, but his third, also gets out kind of vague evidence, not direct, that he was given maybe some compensation. Max Ellicher, now that he's been called out as a communist and friend of potential spies, lost his job. Didn't have that anymore, but somehow he was able to buy a new car weeks before the trial. So Ellicher, obviously not the main witness, but as you can see, provides this kind of independent point of corroboration and is the first in this whole stable of witnesses who have a lot hanging over them, and the prosecution can just, and the FBI can just squeeze to make whatever claim they want.
So it's insurance against the jury deciding, well, Ruth and David are also spies. We can't trust them.
Yeah.
So eventually they wind up on the stand, right?
Exactly. So David is the next witness on the stand, and the prosecution does an interesting presentation with David. They have him go up on the stand and then step off the stand and put on, at two different times, witnesses who are not atomic scientists themselves, but know enough and are part of enough of the Manhattan District Project to be able to say, oh yeah, this information that David has just said he gave the Russians, it's real stuff. It's not made up. It is part of the atomic bomb. But David's put on the stand, and he cannot stop smiling the entire time. He is this gremlin on the stand. And at one point, Manny Block says in his cross-examination of David, do you realize that you're smiling? And he goes, not very. And he just continued smiling in the courtroom. As he's saying this information that was putting his sister in the electric chair, he makes a number of claims, and we're going to have to individually go through the claims that David makes, because unless you go through them, you don't know how much he's changed the story and how much they're framing Ethel and Julius. So first off, in David's and Ruth's new rendition of the story, David is approached by Ruth while he's at Los Alamos, and Ruth says that Ethel and Julius asked her to talk to him about giving information to the Russians. And while reluctant at first, Ruth agreed to do this. And David says he's reluctant at first, but he wanted to do it because Julius is right. And he's convinced him that the Russians are on our side and that he will give the information.
So he's sort of adopting the story that Ruth was telling.
Correct.
Right.
About Ethel and Julius. Yes. In his first rendition, it's just Julius talking to Ruth.
Yes. Okay.
As we said before, this is not quite right because Ethel did not need to convince Ruth, and Julius didn't need Ethel to convince Ruth. Ruth was all in already. And this is where things get kind of crucial. They have the January meeting where they talk with Julius, and David has a vague recollection that he met with a kind of shadowy Soviet man who asked him questions about the atomic bomb. He gives some names, but not the crucial information, not the case that the prosecutor wants to make, that David gave either the diagrams of the explosive lenses or the quote-unquote secret of the atomic bomb. That comes later with what we like to call the June meeting. Now, the June meeting is where a Soviet courier or contact is going to go ahead and meet with David and Ruth, or in this rendition, just David, at his house in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he's going to be able to see who he is, because before the June meeting, Julius has met with Ruth and David and has said, you have to have a signal so the contact recognizes who you are. And he pulls out a Jello box and cuts it irregularly so that there's two pieces that fit together. One goes to Ruth and David. One Julius is going to take to the Soviet contact. So he's the person that cuts and makes the Jello box. He makes what's called the material signal that will allow these two people to recognize each other. An unknown Soviet contact and the people on the ground, David and Ruth. We know this to be a made-up story. We know this to be a made-up story because Vasilyev's notebooks say that at this time, in February, before Ruth has gone back to New Mexico and meet up with David, that the Soviets are saying, we need a oral and a material signal from Ruth, aka WASP. And they're only talking about her because by this point, Julius is on ice. He's suspended. He's fired. As Walter Schneer says, he's gotten a pink slip from the KGB.
Right. So they're taking... So David basically took something that actually happened with Ruth, his wife, and sort of lifted the details of it and picked it up for Julius.
Yes, and that's why in his first interrogation, you can see it now, he says, I don't remember whether my wife gave me the Jello box or Julius. He hedged on that. Except he didn't remember. I think he was like, yeah, maybe I'll say later it was just Julius. Even though I know it was my wife. Because at the time, Julius was a suspended spy. He was temporarily an ex-spy.
Yeah.
And just kind of on the face of it, my impression is that... So Jell-O at the time, during war and during wartime rationing, was used to kind of like stretch desserts. This is the origin of like Jell-O casseroles and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And Ruth, but she's stretching stuff. She's been told by her Soviet contact now, you need to make a material signal, and she has a cardboard Jell-O box, cuts it irregularly. I'm sorry, this fits together as being Ruth. So what actually happened? Ruth cuts this Jell-O box, and she gives one half to her Soviet contact. She's been put directly into contact with him. And that contact almost certainly gave it to Harry Gold. In the trial rendition of this, Harry Gold comes up and says to David, I come from Julius. So in other words, the Soviet contact, and this is like an inherently unbelievable...
It's not a very good oral signal.
Yeah.
Julius.
Forget code names and everything. I'm just going to say, hey, your brother-in-law sent me, bro.
Yeah. Ugh.
We obviously know this is false, and in fact, there are recordings of Gold saying what he actually said or remembered saying as his password. He's like, it was something like Benny sent me or Dave sent me or something else along those lines. I'm gonna insert the audio recording of Gold actually saying it here.
I believe that it involved the name of a man and was something on the order of Bob sent me or Benny sent me or John sent me or something like that.
But this didn't implicate Julius enough in this whole transaction. The FBI, I think, could see that. So David Greenglass couldn't remember exactly what was said as far as the password. And so they did what any good investigator does, and they took both of their witnesses whose testimony they don't believe, they put them together to straighton their stories out in December of 1950.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So that's where they came up with, I come from Julius. Apparently Harry Gold said, I said to you, Benny sent me or something like that. And David Greenglass responded, no, I wouldn't have let you in if you had said that. You'd have to say something more familiar to me, like that Julius sent you. That's it. I come from Julius.
So the FBI literally put, just to reiterate this, Harry Gold, their witnesses, Harry Gold and David Greenglass together.
Yes.
And we're like, okay, tell us the story now, the two of you.
Yeah, why not? And could hear them their stories not meshing, and then trying to negotiate how to work out a story.
Wow.
So they know that they're making this shit up. Mm. The other thing that changed at the trial is at this point, David and after Ruth testifies, Harry Gold say that the information that David gives in this meeting in June is very important, very excellent. Prior to trial, Harry Gold actually told his lawyers, and it's audio recorded, I'll drop in the segment, that his contact, who he only knows as John, he knows this guy Anatoly Yatskov as John, that John tells him that basically this shit, don't talk to this guy again.
I turned the information over to John. John never mentioned anything about it. And on the one occasion when I did mention this man, sometime in the late fall of 1945, John had said that we could forget all about him, that there wasn't much point in getting in touch with him. And I got from the manner in which he made the remark that apparently the information received had not been of very much consequence at all.
But the reason that this June meeting is important for the trial case is you have Harry Gold there who will testify that he has met with a Soviet agent who he knows as John, he knows he's a Russian guy and everything. And Harry Gold provides that link in the chain to David.
Both David and Ruth say they received $500 after giving the envelope filled with the information.
And they have an entry from a bank account opened up by Ruth and David that has $400 going to that account right after they say the meeting happens. So there's a neat little meeting of the gears of this case with that June meeting that has to happen.
So what about that September meeting?
So at trial, David Greenglass and Ruth Greenglass make up a September meeting where they don't meet with Harry Gold. They actually go back to Julius Rosenberg's apartment.
This is a different meeting in September in New York?
Yes.
September 1945, New York, probably made up meeting?
Right. So in David Greenglass's first interrogations, he doesn't remember any September meeting. But as the evidence is developed and evolves and improved by the FBI, David and Ruth remember having dinner with Ethel and Julius after he gets back from Los Alamos. And in this scenario, David meets up with Julius and hands over to him about 11 pages of notes on basically how the atomic bomb works, how the plutonium implosion bomb works. And Julius goes, wow, this is excellent material. And they both decide that David's handwriting isn't too good, that someone needs to type up these notes to give to their Soviet contact. So it's handed over to Ethel, who, like Ruth, has been trained as a typist, and she begins dutifully typing the notes. This scenario where Ethel types the notes is one of the most confirmably made up parts of this case. Until 2 weeks before the trial. Actually, about 2 weeks before the trial, no one said that Ethel typed up any notes. David's handwriting is perfectly legible. He
according to other samples.
He's pretty precise in his handwriting. It's perfectly legible. So this was always had a little bit of suspicion about it, but it turns out that this trial starts on March 6th. Ruth first comes up with this story under questioning by the prosecutors, namely Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's later attorney, on February 22nd. So just weeks before the trial. David, who you remember said, oh yeah, Ethel wasn't involved in any of this stuff, didn't say anything about that. And then just a couple days later, the prosecutors, namely Roy Cohn, but also James Kilsheimer, he was in that meeting too, even though he actually is still innocent, says, oh, your wife said that Ethel met with you guys in September and that she typed out the notes that you wrote down of how to build a bomb. He says, oh yeah, if my wife said that, that's true. They send a teletype, and that becomes the story.
So beyond the
10 days before trial, they make up this story.
So beyond the convenient timing, what else? Is there any other evidence in terms of whether or not this meeting happened?
Oh, in terms of the September meeting?
Yeah, September meeting.
So, no, there's evidence that it didn't happen.
Right. What is some of that evidence?
Sure. On the grand jury testimony where both Ruth and David are under oath, David says that maybe a September meeting happened. Ruth denies that any meeting in September happened. That no meeting...
Even though she had made up the story a few weeks ago. Oh, this is the grand jury phase.
Yeah.
Okay.
But moreover, in 2001, to Sam Roberts, David just admitted that he lied. He said, I don't remember Ethel writing the notes. Roy Cohn basically made me do it.
Jeez. And the other thing that I thought of is like, it just seems so pat. It's like, I have 11 pages of the secret of the atomic bomb. Like, was there any evidence he had that any such like 11-page document about the atomic bomb in 1945 existed, and B, that David Greenglass would have anything like access to it, if there was?
So I think he did have some pages of notes.
Right.
Because there was actually a meeting in September, but it wasn't with Julius, who's still on ice.
Yeah.
And it definitely wasn't with Ethel, and it wasn't at their apartment.
Mm-hmm.
David met with a KGB, a Soviet agent. He met briefly with him. The notes say in the KGB archive. He handed to him materials, and he handed to him a cartridge. So he actually did meet in September, and prior to this invention of a September meeting in Julius and Ethel's apartment, they covered up that they ever met with anybody in September. The only mention of it is David, in one of his kind of equivocating things, says, I don't remember if I met with a Soviet guy in January or when I was on leave in September. And that's the only hint about it.
For this next part, listeners, we decided it deserves its own small segment. During this September meeting, supposedly with Julius and Ethel, David Greenglass claimed that the material he turned over contained a cross-section sketch and a detailed description of the implosion-type atomic bomb. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Quoting from the trial transcript, Prosecutor Sapel says, question. Now, would you tell us just what happened, Mr. Greenglass, after you handed this sketch and descriptive material concerning the atomic bomb to Rosenberg? What did he do, and what did the others there do? Answer. Well, he stepped in the other room, and he read it, and he came out, and he said, this is very good. We ought to have this typed up immediately. Question. Who did the typing, Mr. Greenglass? Answer. Ethel did the typing, and Ruth and Julius and Ethel did the correction of the grammar. This testimony locked Julius and Ethel Rosenberg into having stolen, quote, the secret of atom bomb. At the FBI's direction, David recreated for the prosecution team this cross-section sketch, which is forever immortalized as exhibit number 8. And other prosecution witnesses testified that the sketch showed the secret principle of the atomic bomb accurately. But rather than disputing the value of the exhibit, cross-examination, in one of his greatest errors, Emanuel Bloch asked for the exhibit to be held secret and impounded by the court. Exhibit 8 and David's description contained several telltale errors, however. And these identifiable errors, mistakes that Greenglass left like a fingerprint, were found on a real description transmitted by the NKGB and found later in the 1990s in the Atomic Energy Archives. But that description wasn't from September, and couldn't have come from a September meeting in New York at all. It was from December. David and Ruth hadn't handed secrets off to Julius and Ethel in New York at all. They likely handed them off to Soviet courier Lana Cohen in New Mexico in December of 1945. When David and Ruth gave over this atomic information, Julius, much less Ethel, wasn't even aware. When David gave over the atomic information, Julius and Ethel weren't even in the same state.
So then, since we're still in David and Ruth's testimony, David gives a whole host of amazing stories about Julius's exploits as a spy, and they all pretty much go on the same path, which is, I was hanging out in the shop one day, and Julius was like, hey, David, let me tell you something that my boys did. He literally says, yeah, my boys.
Really?
Yeah.
My boys, the Soviets?
No, my boys, my CCNY spy
Oh,
network
okay,
people.
yeah.
So yeah, my boys are getting this, and my boys are getting information on that, and David's just like, yeah, okay.
That's cool.
But among these is a sky platform, a large platform meant to be in like geosynchronous orbit around the Earth.
Like a space elevator.
So not like a space elevator, but just like a really, really big satellite.
Wow.
That you could launch stuff off of or mount stuff on.
I feel like that wasn't really a thing they had back then.
No, and they don't have it now because it's really hard. Also, there's a nuclear-propelled jet that David says Julius told him about. So the reason these things even come about in David's testimony is the FBI is asking him about things that William Pearl, one of Julius's CCNY friends, was working on. And did David hear anything about that? And so much like the whole watch thing, he's like, oh yeah, I remember. Julius, implied that he got a watch from the Russians. David says, oh yeah, I did hear about that. And it's tough to say whether he heard anything at all, whether it was fed to him by the FBI. But as best I can tell, if he did hear anything, it was just Julius saying, like, I talked to my friend Bill, and Bill's working on a nuclear jet. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And talking about they solved the math on the nuclear jet.
Right, and no evidence.
Or on a sky platform.
Right.
William Pearl also worked on a project that was hoping to eventually do that. He was working at basically the predecessor to NASA.
Yeah, and did he say, I passed these secrets off to the Soviets?
So David implied that he did, that he was getting information and he passed information that was very valuable. But no, he doesn't even really go that far to say like, oh yeah, I got this. And the FBI spent like loads of man hours to try to determine whether Julius got information on the nuclear jet from something called the Lexington Report. And when the FBI's Bureau Lab forensically examined a copy of the Lexington Report that may have gone to William Pearl, his friend, they found that no, he actually could not have taken any pictures of this. The binding on this has never been breached. The pages haven't been turned like that. You wouldn't be able to photograph it unless you breach the binding and take it out.
Right, yeah.
Rip it up. So, other than idle shop talk, don't think any of those secrets were taken. I don't think that happened.
Right, but it did help contribute to this idea that Julius was, actively trying to give the Soviets like our most advanced science fictional weaponry.
Yeah, in a time period in which he was probably on ice and had no contact with the Soviets, or his contact with the Soviets is trying to recruit David to do stuff,
right?
Which David never talked about. He's giving the impression that there's overwhelming evidence that Julius is involved in stealing like all of the secrets, and has
the
an
spy
immense network.
master.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm gonna, for this next bit with David's testimony, I'm actually gonna merge some of his testimony with Ruth's, because Ruth largely confirms a lot of what David says and also holds up really well under cross-examination because she is tough. And that is a maddening piece of evidence in the case, more maddening for me than even the Hilton Hotel card, and that is the console table. Now, both David and Ruth talk about a console table that they see in Julius and Ethel's apartment that they say is a gift from the Russians to the pair to carry out spy stuff. And while David doesn't talk about this, Ruth says that a part of the console table has been hollowed out and that there's a light placed in it so that you can basically put documents on top of the console table and photograph them, which is kind of like, holy shit, you have tools of the spy trade in your house. You are obviously a spy. And it's a very detailed description of a table here.
Don't engineers use those though, like light tables for blueprints?
Yeah, but by this point, Julius is really just kind of like the salesperson of the machine shop.
Okay.
He's not actively doing engineer stuff. But yeah, I mean, a fair point. But
well, I see your point anyway.
Rather than being this insane spy table, when they actually take the stand, Julius and Ethel say, like, I bought that at Macy's for $21. So this becomes a point of debate as to whether they have a spy console table that has been hollowed out or has 3 holes placed in it so you can mount a camera and then just be like kind of moving documents in and photographing them. in this very detailed, vivid description that you would think is hard to make up, like this detail. And it turns out really was just a table from Macy's. And David admitted to not even seeing it in their apartment when he actually interviewed with Sam Roberts in 2001.
That's another admission from him.
Yeah, and I'll put a picture of it on the episode notes here, because it's a table.
Yeah.
It's just a table. I would say the console table is one of the most vivid examples that these two witnesses went into a lot of detail here, very vividly testifying against people who are not strangers to them. That's very convincing to a jury. It's not just why would he make that up, but how would they make that up in such detail?
Right, where would it all come from?
You have names, dates, times, places,
Yeah.
vivid descriptions of the apartment that they're in. How is this guy making this up? They're not.
Right.
Is the obvious conclusion for a jury, but they totally did. The answer is they couldn't have made that up without tons of help from the FBI.
And collaboration amongst each other.
But as much of a fabricator as David is and Ruth is, they pale in comparison next to the next guy, which is Harry Gold, that's finally put on the stand. And I've teased listeners long enough with talking about Harry Gold without really going into it. But
Yeah,
Harry
you
Gold,
deliver the goods.
yeah, Harry Gold was a chemist from Philadelphia, and I've talked a little bit about his home life and everything like that. In the 1930s, he started spying and doing industrial espionage for the Soviet Union, and basically just acted as a go-between for where they wanted to send him. So people would reach out to them, they would send Harry Gold as the courier. He would also act as a handler, right? Maintaining contact with these people and being very diligent about keeping track of their names, dates, numbers, and so on. In thanks for this, the Soviets actually put him through college to get a degree in chemistry and to then be able to open up his own business, hopefully, and so on.
Probably do more effective spying that way.
Yeah, rather than opening his own business and just having kind of a front that would account for, oh, I'm taking a trip here, it's a business trip, and I don't have to tell anybody about what I'm doing, and they can't say that I was lying.
Right.
Harry Gold decides to go into business with a kind of a borderline contact named Abraham Brothman.
Okay.
Abe Brothman had a business doing various things and kind of developing a lot of his own inventions and designs, which he hoped to get contracts with the Soviet Union with. He's a leftist sympathetic guy, but more importantly, he's like, if I can convince the Soviets that they should like my stuff that I've designed, I can make a lot of money. So Abe Brothman is passing on sketches and blueprints of his own design of non-classified information to Harry Gold and later witness Elizabeth Bentley. And after the war, business not being too good, Harry Gold goes into business with Abe Brothman against what the Soviets want him to do.
Oh, wow.
Now, as the FBI is told things by Elizabeth Bentley about who she's had contact with, they begin investigating Brothman and Gold. Gold's brought before a grand jury and makes up a whole host of lies about what they were doing in business. It doesn't match up with what Abe Brothman says, which is frankly seems to be what happened. He's like, I wrote up stuff in my own design. I know Harry Gold. I know the Soviet contact, Jacob Golash. I met with Elizabeth Bentley. That's what happened. I didn't do anything illegal. But the FBI and the Justice Department assemble a case that Abe Brothman and his mistress/administrator in the business, Miriam Moskowitz, were pressuring and collaborating with Gold in making up a story that would remove them from any liability for espionage. So that they're not spying, they're not giving away information that's classified or whatever, but because they supposedly encouraged Gold to lie to the grand jury, they're guilty of conspiracy to obstruct justice. And this actually became kind of a test case for Irving Sapol and the whole prosecution team before the Rosenberg case.
Interesting.
But in that case, Harry Gold's tendency to make up things that were not true came out. I'm going to read a little bit from the Schneer's book, Invitation to an Inquest, on what I mean when I say Harry Gold was really professional lying. Question by Hopkins, now that's the attorney for Moskowitz and Brothman, about his imaginary family. Gold replied, "First I created this wife whom I did not have, then there had to be children to go along with a wife, and they had to grow old, so I had to keep building one on top of the other." Goes on. "Did you ever make this statement? Quote, 'It is a wonder that steam didn't come out of my ears at times.' Gold. That really is. I mean, it's really remarkable that it didn't occur." Hopkins. "Because of the lies you told?" Gold. "I had gotten involved in one of the doggonedest tangles."
Yeah.
Hopkins. "You lied for a period of 6 years?" Gold. "I lied for a period of 16 years, not alone 6. Gold also told Hopkins, "When I went on a mission for the Russians, I immediately turned a switch on in my mind, just set my mind, just as if it were an automaton to do a particular job, and I just went ahead, and the information turned over, it came back, and I came back again." Hopkins asked, "Have you ever, to your own knowledge, suffered from schizophrenia?" "As far as I know, I have not." So Harry Gold made up so many things and admitted to making so many things that this was another piece that led the Schneers and frankly many others to think maybe there actually is no case.
Right.
Because if you don't have Gold saying, "I met up with the GI and I am Klaus Fuchs's contact," if Gold's just making up things because he spontaneously makes up things like having a wife and twin children, and then I think his fake wife cheats on him with a fake friend.
And he made all that up. That it wouldn't be out of the question that he would make up.
Meeting with Klaus Fuchs, meeting with David Greenglass, meeting with anyone, in which case there's no Russian contact and there's no case.
Yeah.
Right? So that's an understandable theory. And just to add a little bit to this, I'm going to read a report that the FBI wrote when they kind of got upset at Mr. Gold. So reading from this report, and it was actually kind of hard for me to pull it out because there's actually a lot of reports where the FBI is like, "Ah, God damn it, Harry Gold lied to us again." Gold further advised that he had furnished false information in saying that he had not made his regular meeting in December of 1949. Gold stated that his reason for previously furnishing false information in connection with this matter was his desire not to show, quote, "an overt doubt on his part by continuing to meet with this Russian." He further explained that these falsehoods as being due to his inability to start suddenly telling the truth after having lived a life composed of a web of lies and falsehoods for so many years. There are also different FBI reports that say that Harry Gold made up to the Soviets 3 or 4 different contacts who didn't actually exist, who he's getting paid to meet with.
Oh, yeah. So he seems like kind of a compulsive liar.
Yeah, like incredibly compulsive. So Harry Gold, however, gets up on the stand and just basically corroborates David Greenglass's story. He was told by John to go meet with this GI in New Mexico. He goes to Albuquerque, stays at the Hilton. He meets with him. He gets this information, except now it's not shit information. He hands it to his contact, John, and it's very, very good. Excellent information. One of the biggest defense decisions in this case is Manny Block says that he's not going to cross-examine Harry Gold. And to some extent I can actually understand this, but also I can't. Knowing who Harry Gold is and how he functioned in that other trial where he's just lying his ass off. If Manny Block had gone up and cross-examined him and said, "You've never met my client, have you?" Because he didn't say that he had ever met Julius. He might just say, "Oh yeah, no, I did. I met with him like 20 times. I just remembered." And so with Harry Gold not having seen Julius or said anything about that, he was content to sit there and not cross-examine him. The trouble with that is even if he hadn't seen Julius Rosenberg, he's already gotten on the stand and said, "Oh yeah, I told David Greenglass the password is I come from Julius." Who else is that going to be as far as the jury is concerned? He's already called out your client.
Yeah. Well, so is that another thing where he might have been just afraid to be more assertive?
Yeah. And that brings us to, frankly, the most weird piece of evidence about this June meeting happened that caused, and I can fully understand why, caused a lot of people to think that the June meeting didn't happen and maybe this whole case was just made up from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the Hilton Hotel card.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm actually going to show you the Hilton Hotel card, Peter.
Okay.
So there's a June 3rd, 1945 entry onto a hotel registration card, way back when they had those,
mm-hmm.
which they were put into like a card index. And it says Harry Gold, day rate, and this card was supposed to show that Harry Gold arrived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it backs up his story that he first went to a rooming house, then he went by David's house. David said, "I'm not ready for you right now." So Harry Gold says, "Well, why don't I at least go, get a little shut eye,
mm-hmm,
shit shower,
mm-hmm,
shave,
mm-hmm.
whatever, at a nice place and not some terrible rooming house."
Sure.
Stop in at the Hilton
mm-hmm.
in Albuquerque,
mm-hmm.
and then go back to David's, get the information before hopping on a train. There was always a problem with this because the train schedules actually showed that it would have been hard to impossible for him to actually catch the train that he said he did if this meeting happened. But what we have with the hotel card was something very strange noticed by Walter and Miriam Schneer only in the 1960s. And other writers too, John Wexley and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So just to show you the card, which doesn't look like much at first, I'm going to slowly turn my computer here. Hopefully it doesn't go out on the
nice
audio.
Slow turn.
So
That's
you can see it
like.
says June 3rd, 1945, and then it has those initials AK.
Yeah, it's really, it looks like...
Yeah, so this is a photo stat, so it's kind of blurred.
Right, yeah, it looks like a bunch of hot nonsense from where I'm sitting, but...
Right, so what they didn't share during the trial was that they actually had two hotel cards that Harry Gold stayed under.
Mm-hmm.
One from June when they say he met with David Greenglass, and then one from September when he went back to Albuquerque to get information from Klaus Fuchs.
Okay.
The man who did it.
Right.
The real spy.
Yeah, the real spy who they've got in Britain at that point.
Yeah. So the September card seems pretty legit. You can see everything.
Mm-hmm.
All
I can
the
read
slants
this.
go in the same direction.
This I can
it says
read.
AK, same woman initials it at the Hilton Hotel. You go back to this
so
card,
Isaac
it's a little
now.
vague.
So what just happened there was Isaac's got his laptop up, and there's these two images. There's the September image he showed me that looks pretty clear, and now he's showing me this June image that looks like I said, like a hot mess. I mean, I'm not a documents expert by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a difference.
Yeah, but not even just in the copying quality, but people who later on examined this know that if you look at the September card, on the back...
Yeah, the handwriting's obviously different.
Yeah, that's supposed to be the same person.
Okay.
That's supposed to be the same person on both things.
Yeah.
And it's pretty obviously not.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that handwriting analysis is not as scientific as they say, but that, you could still make at least some inferences.
Right. And people like Walter Merriam-Schneer took this to a document examiner, Elizabeth McCarthy, who looked at it and said, one, these are not written by the same person.
Yeah.
Period. But also, there's other odd aspects with it, like the margins, like the way that the typeset is on here is kind of off, as if it's been written on and then photographed.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other aspect to it that kind of set everyone off was if you look at the September card on the back, it has a stamp date from like an automated mechanical clock thing where you put the card in, it stamps it with the date and the time.
Yeah.
On the June card, which is supposed to show that Harry Gold was in Albuquerque at that hotel, the date is not the date on here. It is actually the next day.
Interesting.
And the Schneers went to the Hilton Hotel and they said, yeah, well, I mean, the stamp date we control because that's a clock, it's a mechanical thing.
Yeah.
Now, later on, kind of to counterattack this claim.
The claim here, is this a Schneer's claim?
Yeah.
So the Schneers claim that this was forged, the June card.
Yes, this was made up. And I mean, they even found...
Forged by the FBI.
Yes.
Okay.
That the FBI got a hold of this June card. They searched and searched and searched for any card that could show that Harry Gold registered in this Hilton hotel.
Because they need to prove somehow that this June meeting existed.
Right. That there's concrete proof that it's not just two people making it up together. And they even interviewed the Hilton Hotel staff manager, who said, the FBI was like up looking through the cards for like days and days in the attic and weren't able to find anything. Whereas normally the FBI would just request it and he would look through and be able to find it immediately by the date.
Right. That's why they have a filing system.
That's the whole point.
So,
With the two cards as well, this June one has no initials of any FBI agents on it. The September one is handled in the normal course, has the initials of all the FBI agents who handled it. Chain of evidence. They will be able to testify at trial to introduce this piece of evidence. So there's something very weird and aberrant about this hotel card, and frankly, the whole...
So you said there was a counterattack.
Yeah, so Ronald Radosh in the 1980s went back through the FBI files and found that they also thought that this stamp that has a different date as on the front was weird as well, and that they went to the hotel and that the hotel manager, at least according to their reports, said, oh yeah, I looked through all the ones for that day, and they also had the weird stamp problem. It was like miscalibrated or misaligned.
So we know...
No harm, no foul. But it doesn't explain all the other things with it, which is because I also read that initially in Ron Radosh's book and was like, oh, well, I guess that explains it. All this other stuff is just, I'm not a document examiner, who cares?
Right.
Then I actually looked at both cards, and they're really seem to be written by two different people.
Yeah. Now, as it happens, I mean, these days we have, evident, like this other body that we can look to, namely the Russian stuff, the Venona cables and the Vasiliev notebooks.
Right.
Does that reflect at all on this June meeting?
So it appears to show that the June meeting happened, right?
Oh.
There's a Vasiliev notebook entry from about June, it's either 21st or 27th, that says that Arno, who is Harry Gold, met with Caliber, who's David Greenglass, and received information from him, and that it's not of much value.
Okay.
Appearing to kind of just be aligned with what Harry Gold said to his lawyers, that he met with the guy, didn't say he came from Julius, received this information, his contact said, this is crap, don't meet with this guy again. That all appears to dovetail with what the notebooks say. But...
So why bother? Why bother with all this shenanigans?
Like, why bother with the forgery, right?
Right, if it is a forgery.
My kind of thinking on this, and why I think it still may be a forgery, is it may well have been that Harry Gold actually did have this June meeting, but the FBI doesn't necessarily believe their own witness.
Right.
And they might think they need to do this. And I think one kind of comparison we can do from history with this is in the cause célèbre of the late 19th and early 20th century, the Dreyfus Affair.
Yes.
There's an incredible piece of forged evidence that's famous in French history called the Faux Henri, which is this guy in the French military, Colonel Henri, went ahead and he believed the guy he was framing to be guilty. He believed Albert Dreyfus to be guilty. And in order to show that there was some kind of documentary proof that this guy Dreyfus was meeting with the German consulate, was meeting with German intelligence, he took two pieces of unrelated correspondence from that embassy, from the German intelligence, and glued them together, and possibly also wrote on his own stuff. And this wasn't discovered until years after Dreyfus was convicted, that the margins on these two documents were totally dissimilar. And it was absolutely proven when Colonel Henri killed himself.
Yeah.
But at the time, the reactionary forces were like, you know what? We still believe Dreyfus is guilty. And Charles Marat, the famous proto-fascist, said that this forgery was one of his greatest acts of military duty that he did. So I still think it's possible that in seeing Harry Gold change his story and not be able to really remember exactly how this June meeting happened, And even saying that he didn't remember it originally happening. His first interrogations, he doesn't remember any June meeting at all. That they go, we got to shore this up because no one's going to believe this guy.
Right.
The next witness, and this is kind of a way the prosecutions like to tie up a case with a bow, is Elizabeth Bentley, who's called on as basically an expert witness in communism and communist espionage. A prosecutor, even like a drug case or a gang case or something like that, will want to tie up a case where a lot of otherwise suspicious, sketchy, but otherwise not criminal behavior needs to be explained as being part of a pattern. So it kind of translates these innocuous behaviors for a jury and says, these are consistent with this. So a jury might hear about like, oh yeah, these two guys met in a car and there was a quick movement in the car, and then this one guy gets out, he's arrested by the police, he has cocaine on him. The other guy is arrested by the police, he has nothing on him. And then you bring on an expert to say, this quick transaction is what I know to be a hand-to-hand, where two guys get in a car so they can be out of sight. There's a quick movement because they try to make it as quick as possible, and I know that to be a regular characteristic of drug dealers. I also know that the way that his money is in his wallet in these non-sequential amounts or these sequential amounts is consistent with drug dealing and so forth. Elizabeth Bentley's brought on to do the same thing with communism and espionage. And her area of expertise is by at one time being the secretary / mistress of a guy named Jacob Golosh, who, as far as we can tell from Vasilia's notebooks, is actually the guy that recruited Julius. Jacob Golosh was a Jewish, Ukrainian-born communist who immigrated to the United States and operated kind of a front business and also a kind of private intelligence network that was half in the KGB and half out.
Interesting.
Half some of his stuff that he could sell to them and half not.
What happened to him?
In 1943, he just died.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Not anything suspicious. Not any not any Carlo Tresca stuff.
Right. He
just keeled over.
Does. Yeah.
Yeah. And in 1945, Elizabeth Bentley, who has managed his affairs for a while up until that point, she goes ahead and she goes to the FBI office herself. Her background is extremely strange, and we don't have enough time to get into it, but she was actually a full-on Ezra Pound-loving Italian fascist as a student studying in Italy.
Oh, wow.
And then converted to communism after falling in love with Jacob Golosh in her account. But oddly still was hanging out with Italian fascists in New York City after his death.
Well, yeah,
so
you don't
maybe
just give
there's
up on
something
your
a little bit
friends.
suspicious about that.
Yeah.
So she comes on and she says basically that she's one of these like top tier, god tier contacts of upper levels of the Communist Party. That they're all aware of how the intelligence network works, and that she practically orders them around with orders from Moscow. Her one piece of evidence that bears on the case is another late developed kind of bullshit piece of evidence. She says that she received a phone call at one time from a guy saying his name was Julius, and that she was driven to Knickerbocker Village, where Julius Rosenberg lives, and she remembers seeing a man with wireframe glasses, and she thinks it was the man in the courtroom. He's a little suspicious. It turns out she did give a report to having seen a guy named Julius all the way back when she was talking with the FBI a long time ago, and this is used to say, like, I think this has maybe happened. But she didn't say that was in New York. She said it was in Norfolk. Virginia.
Norfolk, Virginia?
Yeah, because the FBI at that time was investigating another communist engineer guy named Julius Cochin.
Oh, and she mixed them up? Or the FBI mixed them up, or they just remixed it? Like, what happened?
It's the remix version.
Okay.
It's, okay, well, you said there was a Julius that you were taking to meet.
That's amazing.
Okay. Where did you meet him again?
That's crazy.
In Vasilia's notebooks, Julius does admit to calling Jacob Golosh's office and maybe talking to her one time. But otherwise, they're like, yeah, we don't think you're exposed at all. I mean, she never met up with you. And he goes, no. Her main role there as an expert witness isn't this one little, like, point of, I saw him too. It's to essentially say that as communists, these people are all potential spies. And the evidence of communism then becomes evidence of spying. She says their loyalties to the Soviet Union, not the United States.
Yeah.
It has a double effect of making the jury into a political force that you don't have to treat these as separate issues anymore. In the entire trial, Manny Block's been jumping up and down at any mention of communism, saying this is not a trial about their political beliefs.
Yeah.
You can't use it as evidence to show that they're spies.
Right.
The prosecution says we will show that that's evidence they're spying.
By Elizabeth Bentley.
And after Elizabeth Bentley's brought in, then any evidence that they're communists becomes evidence of their proclivity to spy.
Right.
So they're able to drag in absolutely insane pieces of evidence. Like they drag in a coffee can that says "Save the Spanish Republican Child" that they used to raise money.
During the Spanish Civil War.
For the Spanish Civil War and afterwards for the refugees and emigres out of Spain when persecuted by Franco, to say, see, they're communists, therefore spy. So them being opposed to fascism became evidence against them.
They're premature anti-fascists.
Yeah.
So basically that very little of this has anything to do with Ethel, and the part that does is like the sketchiest part.
Yeah.
Of a very, or nearly the sketchiest part of a very sketchy set of information.
Wait, were you still out of character there?
No.
Oh.
I can record.
So to kind of wrap up this prosecution presentation of the case here, we have a whole stable of witnesses who have been brought together, all of whom have either something on them or something to gain. In Elizabeth Bentley's case, she isn't just volunteered, she's now like publishing a book at this time. She is being paid money to go on speeches. She is a professional anti-communist witness, like Boucher-Go, like Wicker Chambers, like, and so on. In the case of David and Ruth, they're trying to stay out of the death house. In the case of Max Allicher, he's trying to stay out of prison. And then the other witnesses, like Bernie Greenglass and so on, are kind of ancillary. They're just there to kind of say, like, what David's saying is not lying. In this respect, or in this teeny respect, none of them are able to say, well, when you have this kind of, frankly, frame up, I think the big picture thing to remember and why this still matters is you're not talking about simply the binary question of whether Julius did what's charged or whether Ethel did what's charged. She didn't. You're talking about a separate crime that's been committed by the people who are supposed to be investigating a case. When you're charged with producing a case, these legal safeguards aren't just like civil liberties safeguards meant for academics. They're meant to prevent an FBI agent or a prosecutor from being able to use testimony and the papers they write and the things that they write down from procuring the ability to kill someone. Or to essentially kidnap and hold someone in a facility for years or decades at a time. That becomes a crime in itself.
Yeah, it's not just this abstract winning or losing. It's not a game.
Yeah, and the historians debate back and forth about whether or not Julius's level of culpability or whether Ethel has any culpability at all. But no one seems to talk about how there's ample evidence, and there was even ample evidence back in the 1970s, that the prosecution on this case procured the kidnapping and attempted murder of at least one person with false testimony, and frankly both of them with false testimony, in order to just get Julius Rosenberg to talk. And I think I'd like to rest this with the conclusive evidence they've been promising, or fairly conclusive in my view, that Ethel was innocent. Julius did what was legally charged, right? He did commit
He didn't do all
conspiracy.
the things that they said,
right?
But he did do enough to sustain a guilty verdict.
Right, he was legally guilty.
But Ethel did not.
Ethel was legally innocent, factually innocent, and so on. And the reason that we know this is because now that we have Vasilia's notebooks and Venona and so on, we know that Ethel was never given a code name. And to break this down a little bit, you're not just given a code name when you're like the active, best, god-tier agent, get called caliber. You're given a code name whenever you're a potential prospect for an agent. When There's a entry in Vasiliev's notebooks where David talks about some people at University of Chicago who he might want to talk to about potentially becoming contacts. And before he's gone to Chicago, which he never does, before he's even called or talked to them, by supplying their names, the Soviets go, we're classifying these people as the following code names. And he gave each of them code names immediately.
Yep. So it's not just, so in the term of art, it's not just agents, it's also assets or potential assets.
Agents, assets, potential assets all get code names.
Yeah.
The reason being is that you want a code name for any person who you believe you will be talking about in the future in operations.
Who you don't want to expose.
Exactly. And furthermore, there is actually an entry both in Venona and in Vasiliev's notebooks that describes Ethel, Liberal's wife, and says she does not work. She knows of our activities, and she does not work. And the Venona translator wrote down that work in this context means active operations. She is not actually doing these things. It says because of her poor health. Well, one, Ethel did have poor health, and two, I think there's nothing else that it could mean there. And later on, conservative historians will say, well, Ethel didn't work. She was a housewife.
Right.
Well, one, value female labor. Domestic labor is real labor.
That's right.
And screw you. But two, this is the fucking late 40s.
Right.
Saying, oh yeah, she doesn't work, would have wasted the space on the telegram back to Moscow.
Yeah.
They don't mean that because that wasn't a thing that would have gone through their heads.
Right.
They're not asking, oh yeah, Ethel, what does she do?
Right.
They know she's Liberal's wife. They don't care anymore because that's not how they think of this.
I mean, they don't mention Julian's job in that, do they? They're not just like talking about people's civilian employment in that memo.
No, they do that in other biographical sketches, but not this.
Right.
What they want to know is, one, is New York running this person as an asset? And two, how reliable is she? Especially if she's not an asset.
Right.
So that the messages are all, Liberal's wife doesn't work for us. She's debilitated by ill health. Factually true. Due to her back and everything else. And three, nevertheless, she knows about his stuff. She's a reliable communist. She's not going to tell on us.
Right.
She's not going to flip on us.
Yeah.
You know, you don't usually get, whether you're a defense attorney or on appeal, a document by the people who did the crime who said, yeah, this person, they don't work for us. They didn't do the crime. But in this case, as close as you could possibly get to that, you have it. The KGB says she didn't work for them. They never gave her a code name. And it accords with every other piece of the evidence in the case. David originally denying that she had anything to do with this. Ruth denying everything.
So that's in Venona.
It's in Venona.
They have that information.
Yes.
The FBI has the information at the time.
Yes.
And the FBI, I guess, decided... I mean, I guess then the question becomes, did the FBI push this? Did the judges or the prosecutors, the federal prosecutor's office, push this narrative that Ethel was a part of it, despite the fact that they had the Venona cables? I mean, I guess it would have to start.
No, they did do that, and they know they did it. They did it knowingly and intentionally, because on August 4th, you have the memo saying that we need leverage on Julius, quote, leverage, and that's why they took the hostage.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you hear about, you see depictions of things like this in, like, crime fiction. I can't think of that many good examples, but stuff like, if you don't talk, we'll go after your brother, etc., etc. And, like, I'm pretty sure that's, like, mostly bullshit, right? Like, that's the kind of thing you could get. Or maybe it's not, I don't know, you're the lawyer.
This is pretty beyond the pale,
yeah,
even for the time. And I mean, like, the 1940s in local jurisdictions, you had some really dirty stuff.
Sure.
1950s.
I mean, among other things, this is a federal bench, which is supposed to be...
It's supposed to be efficiently and professionally run operation. J. Edgar Hoover's supposed to be doing an efficiently and professionally run operation.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the end of the day, they're just hostage takers because they just saw what they were doing as a war, as like counterinsurgency. And they're just taking the hostage of someone they see as a partisan.
Yep.
Being Julius.
Yeah. I mean, that's how, that's a long-honored tactic in dealing with insurgents of any kind.
So I think we should give it a rest here.
Yep.
Next time, we're going to have to deal with the defense response, such as it is, and then the stronger defense movement response to try to save Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's life, and re-examining all this trial testimony in the waning hours before they're executed, the last-ditch effort. And I think this is a good time as any to say that I think we're going to take a little bit of a break before we get to that final episode here. We know that it's been a long slog for our listeners get to episode 5 of our Rosenberg series, and so we're happy to talk about some other cases, talk about some other things for a couple episodes.
Break it up a little.
But don't worry, we will finish this series off probably in about a month.
Yeah. The thrilling conclusion.
The final conclusion. So with that, listeners, thank you for listening.
All right. Yep. Thanks, folks.
See you next time.
Bye.